And I don't know about you, but I have a really hard time feeling like my life or anything I do is in any way connected with any of that. I don't know about you guys, but I have a hard time feeling like my life is connected directly with the first century church or Jesus' ministry, or even more just like the nation of Israel. It's hard for me to feel like what I do Wednesdays coming in here and singing, or Sundays going to church and just it's hard for me to feel like that stuff, going knocking on doors and doing Bible studies. It's hard for me to feel like that stuff directly relates to God and the nation of Israel and the first century church. Right. Do you guys feel that way sometimes? Yeah. And I was watching the Bible show on the History Channel. Have you guys been watching that? Yeah. It's so awesome. It's just totally sick and mind-blowing how God uses his people, his nation, how he uses Israel and the things he does through them and with them. And it's hard for me to feel like I'm connected to that in any way whatsoever. It feels like what that is powerful and godly and righteous and amazing. And what I'm doing with my life is kind of just more religious and churchy, right? And the truth is, we're going to read later that that's the last thing that Jesus, when he established his church here on earth, when he taught us what it's meant to be a part of the body, that is the last thing that he wanted any of us to feel. Right. He wanted us to feel like we were directly connected to his ministry and everything that he taught and did. Right. And he wanted us to feel directly connected to Old Testament God and Judaism and all those things. He wanted us to feel like we were a part of that, like we were going to be the fulfillment of that plan and that promise. And that regardless of, whether you're Jew or Gentile or whatever, it's like you are a part of God's chosen people now. And you are the continuation of his plan, his story between him and people. And so I was thinking about, why don't we feel like that more? Why don't I feel like what I do in church or what I do as a disciple is directly connected to any of that? Why does it feel like that's so distant and that's so different from what I do? And I think it's because we've lost track of something that's critical when it comes to understanding the body and what that means and what it is to be a part of it. And most importantly, how we play a role in it and how my life is going to be a part of that. And I think what we lost track of is this, and what we're talking about tonight really is this. It's important for us, in order to get back to that, where we are living out exactly what Jesus had in mind when he talked about a body and exactly what God had in mind with his plan for humanity. In order to get back to that, we've got to get back in the right frame of thinking when it comes to who is the head of the body, which is something Andrew kind of talked about a little bit, but we'll go more in depth. And then more than that, what does it mean to be a member? How do you become a member of not just a church or a congregation or a group, but how do you become a member of God's biblical body? How do I become a member of all of that? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And this idea that we've lost track of what it means to be a member of God's body, and that we've lost track of what it means to, kind of fall under the headship of Jesus. This isn't a new idea historically. So just kind of keep going with the history lesson. I feel like mom. All right. So, in history, a long time ago, there's a guy named John Huss. Anyone know who John Huss is? Just off the top of their head. Anyone? Okay. John Huss, just a couple of quick facts. He's around 1400s. Lived and worked in Prague. So what does any of this have to do with what we're talking about? Well, John Huss, what he did, in the Catholic Church, John Huss was this big-time preacher and teacher. When he was really young, went to seminary, went to college in Prague, went to a graduate school. He was this really respected academic name in his place in his time. So he would have been kind of what you might think of when you think of Doug Jacoby. Just real big brain, ultra studied, knew all the history, did all these lectures, did all this teaching at this college that he actually ran in Prague when he lived there. And in addition to being this huge academic mind and name, he was also a preacher. He was a priest in the Catholic Church and ran a congregation where he lived. I think it was called Bethlehem Chapel. And it was pretty much in its day the equivalent of like what we would think of as a megachurch now. Obviously, it didn't have thousands and thousands of people because that really wasn't, how people lived at that time. But his was a big congregation for the time. So John Huss was this kind of like rising star in the Catholic Church. He was this ultra-respected academic and this well-respected, very much admired priest. And so he was kind of climbing up through the ranks of the Catholic Church. But all that changed when what was the date? I didn't write it down. I think it's 1405. He wrote a book called De Ecclesia, which just means the church. So John Huss writes this book, basically in which he goes back to all the things he can find in the Bible about what it means to be God's church and what it means to be a member of God's church. And what he found was that people at the time were living something completely different than what God's original plan for his church was. And they were living completely different from what Jesus taught about what it meant to be part of the body. So he writes all these different things in this book, De Ecclesia, but the two things that it focused on is this. The first thing that it focused on was, what does it mean to be a member of the body in a biblical sense? And what John Huss says in that book, he says that the body is comprised, the way Jesus taught it and the way the Bible teaches it and what God meant when he talked about the body, he says the body is comprised of every true believer who followed Jesus and his commands, every true believer from the time of Jesus throughout all the ages, and even before that, every true believer who was Jewish and who followed God's command. So throughout all the ages, all the people who followed God and his word and his commands, and eventually Jesus, those were the members of the body. That's what built up the body. So to us, we think, yeah, that's kind of obvious. But the truth is that's very different than what was taught at the time because, John Huss was a member of the Catholic Church. And what the Catholic Church taught was that the Pope is the head of the church and all the cardinals make up the body. And it said that basically, normal people, if you weren't in the priesthood, if you weren't a practicing, Catholic priest, you weren't exactly in the body, but you basically had communion with it just by being a good Catholic, by doing things like, paying indulgences, showing up to church, that kind of stuff. It basically got you in communion with the body, but you weren't really a part of God's body. So what John Huss said flew in the face of all that. And then more importantly, after studying it out in the Bible and looking at it for himself, what he determined was that Jesus Christ was the ultimate head of the church. That from the time he established it on earth, he decreed that I am going to be the head of my church. I have sole ownership, sole authority. Everything and everyone in the church is under my complete sovereignty. And he says that's what it meant in the Bible when you talk about body. It was being under the lordship of Jesus. But again, that was really different from what was taught at the time. And really different even than what's taught now. The Catholic Church taught that the Pope was the head of the church, that he was the authority, that he was the head of God's church on earth. And so John Huss talked about these two things, what it means to be a member of the body and who is the head of the body. He determined that this is how we get back. This is how we get out of, his was Catholicism, but whatever it was, this is how we get out of our just religious systems and we get back to what it means to be God's body in the first century Old Testament Jewish nation sense of body. He said all we got to do is redefine our thinking about who's a member of the body and who's the head of it. But again, this was all very defiant in a time where you could not defy the Catholic Church. And what ultimately happened to John Huss, first he was stripped of his priesthood and excommunicated. So he was taken out of the job and kicked out of the town where he lived. Then he was taken by the church and imprisoned. And they actually imprisoned him it was basically a sewer pipe that ran under Prague. So imagine being imprisoned in a sewer for 6 months. And he got to the point where he was so sick that he almost died, and they moved him, but it wasn't much better conditions. So he was in prison. The whole time he was in prison, he was tortured. because they wanted him to renounce what he had taught. They wanted him to say that it's not true and the Pope is the head of the church and everything the Catholic Church says go. But he wouldn't do it. So ultimately, one day he was taken out to the square in Prague where he had actually taught, and he was taken out and he was stripped, and they tied wet ropes around him, and they tied him to a stake and they burned him. Because he wouldn't recount everything that he had taught about who is a member of the body and who is the head of the body. And again, he saw that what he wrote about, what he saw was that since the time of Jesus, we've just gotten so confused about what it means to be a member of God's body and what it means to be under the headship of Christ. If you look at it in first century, religion, I don't know if simple is the word. You had a lot less choices, let's just say that. In the time when Jesus was around and when he established his church, you kind of had three options. You were either a Christian, which Jesus saw as just the continuation and ultimately fulfillment of being a Jew, but obviously Jews didn't see that way. So or you were a pagan. And at the time and the place where Jesus established his church, that was basically it. Those were your major options. You didn't have a lot in between those. You picked one of those three things. But as soon as Jesus left, and as soon as the church, was getting going, even in the first century, right after Jesus left, we started having confusion about that. Started having confusion about who was the head of the body and who were the members and what was it comprised of. The first guys you had coming in were Gnostics. And so you guys have read 1st and 2nd John. It talks a lot about their teaching, that they said a lot about who Jesus was and that he wasn't really divine, and they had some messed up teachings about who Jesus was. Then you had all these different sects, even within the first century church. Some teachers and some believers thought you should be more, still kind of Jewish. You should still be pretty hardcore about your Judaism. Others said, no, being Jewish doesn't matter at all. We don't have to follow any of the old traditions. So you had all these different sects in the first century. Then Rome actually adopts Christianity and it becomes a state religion. So pretty quickly they go from, we're killing you because you're a Christian to we're going to kill you because you're not a Christian. So all of a sudden Christianity has become a state religion. And then you have, kind of the ancient foundations of Catholicism starting in that. So then you've got the Catholic Church, but then you have a guy like John Huss, and you got guys like Martin Luther. And then what you have is Protestantism, that they're getting away from the Catholic Church. But even within Protestantism, you've got Reformation period, and then you've got Restoration period, where you're kind of going back on the Reformation period. And ever since Jesus left, we just keep getting more and more and more and more confused about what it means to be the biblical body of God. Yeah. And we keep disagreeing because ultimately we're not in our actions and in our hearts under God's lordship. We're not under Christ's lordship. We have to change our thinking about that to get back to being the first century body and the body the way God planned it. Amen. This confusion, it wasn't the way Jesus left it. He never intended the church to be that way. It's just our sinfulness that changed it. So now, in our place in time, this kind of continues, right? Yeah. I'm going to write down just a couple of statistics for you. So ever since the time of Jesus, we just keep getting more and more confused, more and more fragmented, more and more separated from the original plan, until finally, 2011. So 2 years old. Sorry, I couldn't find any 2013 stats on this. This is from the Center for Study of Global Christianity. Okay. So where has all this confusion and all this fragmentation left us today? This group in their research in 2011 said that right now there's over 41,000 different denominations of Christianity that exist in the world today. 41,000, each with their different teachings, with their different structure, with their different leadership. 41,000 different denominations of Christianity in the world today. In America, you've got over 1,500. Over 1,500 different denominations in this country alone. And then I looked it up, in the state of Georgia, at the time they did this study, over 348 different Christian churches in Georgia alone. And this is where not understanding what God meant by body and being a member of it and being under Christ's lordship, this is where that's got us. If you look at that, it's not what Jesus intended the body to be. So we got to restore our understanding of how Jesus defined what it means to be a member of a body, rather than what the world says about what it means to be a member of a body. Because the world's going to say, just pick a place, go there, make sure you got good relationships, place membership. That's what it means to be part of the body. But that's completely different than what Jesus taught. So we're going to look at that. Turn over to John 17. We're good. So Jesus, about to be crucified, he's given his, almost his last instructions to his disciples, and he's telling them about what the kingdom, what his church, what his body is going to be like after he dies and is ultimately resurrected and ascends to heaven. He's giving them the instructions for what they need to do. Carter, can you read verse 11, and then Evan, can you read verses 20 through 23? So these are just some of the things that Jesus says his body on earth is going to look like. All right, so Jesus' first prayer for his disciples, but not only for his disciples, but he says for everyone that would come after and believe in him. So that's us. Talking about us and everything that's happened in between first, Jesus' disciples all the way till now. Everyone in between that's a believer. This is his prayer for them. And what does he say he wants? To be one. He says, my prayer for my believers is that they will be one. And not only one, like unified and they're good buddies and, or at least they all get along with each other and work well. He says, I want them to be one in the exact same way that you and I are one. His prayer for us as members of a body, as believers in him, was that all of us, anyone who calls themselves a follower of Christ, would be one in the exact same way that Jesus and God are one. Indistinguishable from one another, part of the exact same thing. He wanted us to be one. Turn over to John 15. Skinner, can you read verse 12? Second thing he wanted. Love one another, right? He wanted all the believers to love one another. Turn over to Acts 2. So we've got be one, and not just be one like get along with each other, but be one the same way Jesus and God are one. We've got love one another. Zach, can you read Acts 2, verses 44 through 47? John, can you read Acts 4, 32? And then, Charlie, can you read Philippians 2, verses 1 through 4? So the last thing that believers would do in living out Jesus' plan for his body was, talks about having everything in common, right? Talks about being like-minded, having the same purpose, the same goal, the same drive, the same vision. He wanted them to be completely unified, but also completely unified in their direction, in where they were going, having everything in common. Right. That there's nothing that separates you. That's awesome. Amongst all my believers, there's not going to be one single thing that separates them. They will have everything in common. So, it's dirty, right? So looking at how Jesus taught his body and what his church was going to look like, and then looking at that. Do those things look alike at all? He talks about having everything in common, and we've got 41,000 different denominations because we've got 41,000 different disagreements, different ways of teaching, different ways of doing things, because we have things that are not in common. We don't love one another as a body of believers. We don't serve one another. We aren't like-minded with the same vision, the same goal of preaching the gospel and just winning the world for God. And that's what's gotten us to that place. So how do we get back to where we are unified? And not just how do we get back to a unified body, like on a world scale, how are we going to merge all these different Christian denominations and stuff like that? Not only that, but how are we in this room going to be a unified body? Yeah. And not just a unified body, but a body that has everything in common with each other. A body that loves one another. A body that's like-minded. A body that would be one as Jesus and God are one. Yeah. How do we get back to that? Well, if we're talking about unity like first century Israel had, what unified first century Israel? What made Israel as a nation with 12 different tribes, millions of different people, all sorts of different disagreements and tiffs between the tribes? What ultimately unified them? God. The only thing that made Israel a nation and the only thing that separated them, the only thing that unified all of them was that they were under the sovereignty of God. Right. The king of this nation is the one true God, and that's where we get all of our definition from. That's who we are as Jews, as Israelites. We don't always get along. We mess up all the time. But ultimately, our King is the one and only true God, and that's what defines us as a nation. So in order for us to find unity as a body, in order for us to help unify believers, we have to get back to, in our kingdom, Jesus is the King. And we are solely defined by that. Jesus is the head of our church, the head of our body. Our whole body gets its definition from the head, which is Jesus. Turn over to Colossians. You guys still doing all right? Yeah. A few more minutes.
Well, Robbie.
All right, look in Colossians 1:15. We have to be defined, if we're going to have unity as a body, we have to be defined solely that we fall under the sovereignty of Jesus and that He is the head of our body. He is the head of our church. He is the head of God's kingdom now. He is the ultimate ruler and authority. We have to be totally defined by this. And I was thinking about this last week. Like Andrew mentioned, I know last week with what was going on with the Pope being elected, a lot of us were watching that and paying attention to that. And I had kind of mixed, torn feelings about that, because on one hand, it was cool to look and see St. Peter's Square, and after they had announced that they had found a pope, it just flooded with people. I mean, I was watching it on my phone in my car, but it people just started flooding into St. Peter's Square. I wasn't driving. No, I was parked. That would be bad. People just start flooding into St. Peter's Square. They've got all the different flags of their nations, and everyone's just celebrating, and it's raining, and they're chanting and singing together. Wow. So I looked at that and I was like, that's cool. I was like, that's pretty beautiful to me, because what it told me, or what I saw from it, is just regardless of different nations or people or whatever, it's like we're all ultimately just trying to find God.
Yeah.
We all ultimately want to feel like we have a connection with God, and that's what all those people were there for, because that was the experience for them, was through this we have a connection with God. Yeah. So I looked at that and I thought, man, that's cool and that's great. But on the other hand, I was really torn about it, because then you look at it, and they elected him, and he came out and he addressed the crowd, and I mean he seems like an awesome guy, and I pray for him, that he seems like he loves the poor, and I don't think, with what I'm about to say, I don't think he's evil or anything like that. I think he's misled. But what was hard to watch about that was you look at that and you realize that ultimately what's going on in that ceremony is they're declaring that he, a man, is the head of God's church on earth. That's the declaration that they're making by making him Pope. And I'm telling you guys, it's not a difference of interpretation of Scripture. It's not just a difference of culture. It's not just a difference of religious traditions. It is nothing less than trampling the crown rights of Jesus. That if Jesus is our King and he is the ultimate authority, for anyone else to claim any different is defying the authority of his throne. It's challenging Jesus for the authority of his church. And it's not just Catholics. I don't want to just make it seem like I'm bagging on Catholics. It's all of us in everything we do. You guys, a lot of you in this room have seen what happens when a church becomes defined by anything other than being under the total lordship of Christ. When it becomes about people, and when it becomes about this leader or that leader, or doing things this way, that way, all different denominations have seen what happens when we don't function under the sole belief that Christ alone is the head of the church. And God, I think, disciplines that. I mean, read in the Bible about people who have taken on the throne or challenged Jesus for authority of his church. And read what happens. And again, it's like, I don't want to make it sound like these people are evil, but it's scary because they're misguided. And we, in our hearts, have done the same thing by not making our whole identity as a body founded under the idea that Jesus alone is the head. Do you guys get that? Does that make sense? Turn over to Ephesians 4. Because the other thing about this is it's not only challenging Jesus for authority of his church, it's not just about who's the head and making sure that no other person claims to be the head other than Jesus. It's really that unless we're completely defined as a body by Jesus being the head, then we won't work the way God designed us to work as a body. We won't be able to function the way he wants us to function as a body. And I'm talking about us in this room. Charlie, can you read Ephesians 4, 2 through 5? And then Jesse, can you read verses 11 through 16? So these scriptures talk about how we function as a body and how we each as individuals play a role. Where it talks about people given different gifts and different roles within the body. One of the things we're going to talk about in a few weeks is how do I find my role in the body? How do I find where it is that God's placed me? How do I use my gifts to be a member of the body and to help it serve this function that they're talking about? But none of that will matter if we don't first get under just the idea that before any of that can come, we have to be completely defined by Jesus being the head of our body. That has to define the people in this room and us as a group, as a body. That has to define us the exact same way it defined Israel. That without Jesus as the head and as the foundation, we're nothing. We're just a group of people that kind of like hanging out together. That has to define us. So I just want to end with this tonight. Think really about why this understanding, everything that Andrew talked about, John Huss, head of the church, members of the body, all the different teachings. Think about what this has to do with us. And I think the first thing is, it's important for us to understand it because this is part of who we are as disciples, and this is part of our mission as disciples of Jesus, right? I mean, God didn't just call us out of the world, and like Andrew said, he didn't just say, I'm scrapping the whole Israel thing, and you guys don't have to really be unified, just get in a good church somewhere and have someone who disciples you, and then you and I will be fine. That's not what Jesus called us to in his mission. And I mean, thank God, because like, how boring would that be if the whole purpose of our life was just to get us and all our little Christian friends in a room somewhere and just make sure none of us fall away? That'd be just awful. I mean, or to me anyway, I think that'd be terrible. But if our mission is to be agents, if our mission is to bring the kingdom of God to earth by how we live and what we do, then healing, all of this stuff falls under that.
Yeah.
You know, healing divisions and getting back to just being under the lordship of Jesus, all that stuff plays a role in your mission, guys. It's not just about seeking and saving the lost. It's about helping to create God's kingdom, helping to create his living body here on earth with our lives. And then in addition to that, it does have a lot to do with us, you know, just here in this room. Because again, if we're not completely defined by this, then we might as well just call ourselves a social club. We might as well just call ourselves, you know, the Alpha Omega, I don't know, fraternity. Yeah, there you go. Fraternity, sorority, / I don't know. But anyway, that's the only thing that we have that's going to make us a part of any of that. Otherwise, we're just a group of people hanging out together. Last thing we're going to read, Ephesians 1. This is how we get to a place where, as a body, God is working through us and living in us by his Spirit. You know, we, each of us, as disciples, have this indwelling of the Holy Spirit. But learning to be a body, by the biblical definition and how Jesus taught it, that's how we get to the point where we're being built up as a dwelling, as a collective dwelling for the Holy Spirit, so that he can work through us to change the world and to do all the things that we've talked about. Amen? So we're going to go ahead and end there. Let me get just someone to pray, and then we'll close out.